And for a change, I'm actually on YouTube for a change, which is a wee bit different because I was, of course, well, I don't know if the algorithm will pick this up, but I was actually banned from YouTube. But I'm delighted to be back here and joined by a man that really is, I would think it was fair to say, colossus in the nationalist movement. Back in the day, Nick, and for those of you that don't, this is Nick Griffin. How are you tonight, sir?
I'm very well, David. Thank you very much. And I ain't finished yet.
Well, that's that. People come up to me and say, "Didn't you used to be David Clews?" But no. Who's the bust behind you, Nick? Excuse my ignorance.
This is the greatest Prime Minister Britain never had, Enoch Powell.
It is Enoch Powell, right? Okay. It was quite interesting because some of my audience, they're slightly right of centre, and they criticise Enoch Powell as being too left wing because he voted for legalisation of abortion and homosexuality bill.
He was a towering intellectual figure, not always right on absolutely everything, but I think on the most important issues, obviously immigration, but also given the fact that we now face the serious possibility of dying in a nuclear war on behalf of the crooks running Ukraine, Powell was the only man on the British right who said throughout the Cold War, Russia is not our natural enemy. Russia is our natural ally. And our long-term problem, in fact, is with the United States. And you wouldn't expect it from someone on the right, which he was, but Powell called that one right as well.
Yes, and I think the term for it is purity spiralling, and I think we can all be quite guilty of that, of looking at people and saying, well, they talk about this, they're right about that, but they don't do this, and I think that is a problem that kind of blights the movement. And I don't perhaps call it as much the right wing now. I call it the true dissident movement, because anybody who's on the left is not a dissident, because the establishment is a left-wing cultural Marxist cesspit, and it's they've taken over everything, and I think that's what I'm keen to talk about tonight, Nick. I think if this goes well, we'll hopefully do more of these in the future. But obviously, you were the leader of the BNP and played a pivotal. I mean, and I talk about this a lot. The BNP were a serious political player. How many votes did the BNP receive at their height, Nick, during the European elections?
The height, taking the European election and the local elections running the same day, we got just under 1 million votes. Right, and that was on a 35% turnout, and it's a massive number.
It is, and I just remember, there was the sort of the seamless transfer from the BNP over to UKIP, wasn't there? And Nigel Farage famously says that his one of his greatest political victories is helping to defeat the BNP. How do you feel when you hear that?
Well, there's no doubt that the BNP was stopped by a number of things. I made mistakes and there were problems within the party. There was an enormous amount of left-wing and establishment infiltration, disinformation, and sowing of discontent. But the biggest problem of all, there was a bit of a problem of not getting new recruits from below because of the English Defence League being ramped up to undercut us from below. But by far the biggest problem was, of course, UKIP. And there is no doubt that the BBC in particular deliberately used UKIP in general and Nigel Farage in particular as a block to stop the British National Party. Farage was a very clever, very cynical and very successful politician. And the irony of it, of course, is that the BBC thought, well, Britain's membership of the European Union is a done deal. It cannot be undone. We're running no risk in boosting Farage, but purely because they've never touched him since. Now the BNP isn't there. How often do you see the BBC covering UKIP or any of these other parties? The answer is never. But they put Farage on Question Time more than 24 times when I had one lynching and we were on equal terms.
I remember it well. I remember it well.
Yeah. And they put him on purely in order. They put him even on things like, have I got news for you? That was purely and simply to block the British National Party. And as a result, inadvertently, they got Brexit. Now, of course, it's not the Brexit that we wanted. It's an extremely imperfect Brexit, but nevertheless, it put an enormous spoke in the wheel of the liberal European and global elite. And it only happened because the British National Party was there That's what forced the BBC to promote Farage. So I'm not bitter about it, because in the end, we got something really beyond our wildest dreams, namely Brexit.
Yeah, yeah, and it was just obviously, Nick. You were talking about the plan, so to speak. Your Kalergi speech, and I still actually see that regularly on Twitter and Telegram, and it still goes around there, and I suppose it doesn't necessarily give you too much of a sense of satisfaction to see how things have played out 20 years later, because the country really is in a terrible, terrible state.
Yeah. Well, when I was first involved in the British National Party in 1993, 1994, because I was in the National Front before then. So way back then, I did a speaking tour of pretty much every branch in the country. John Tyndall was the leader at the time. I did a speaking tour, and the message that I took around the country was that the party had 25 years in which to turn things around, after which, for demographic reasons, not just the raw numbers of them, but also the question of their youth against our overall average age and so on. I said, we have 25 years to turn this around. If it's not done by then, it cannot be done. And time ran out basically in 2015. And I do believe that is the case. So the multiculturalization of Britain cannot be undone, certainly not through the ballot box. And it cannot be done in a successful civil war, because we would lose. Simple as that, quite apart from it being so grotesquely unthinkable. So there's what do we do now? Am I in despair? Is it a black pill? No, because I think there's two possibilities. One is that we could perhaps create from multicultural Britain something like the Lebanon or Syria before the US, British and Zionist intelligence agencies took them to pieces in civil war, where you have many, many different ethnic and religious groups inhabiting the same area, but each really keeping to their own. So the kids play with their own, they marry their own, they have kids with their own, but they all support the same national football team. Now, it might be possible to do that. I'm not saying it's a good thing. I'm just saying that given what we have now, whereby there's so many of them here, there's no possibility of us forcing them out. And equally, there is no possibility of them genociding us. That's some of the most extreme racists, sort of saying, well, once we're a minority, they'll kill us all. No, they won't. You might end up with a situation like the Islamist-created civil war in India, Pakistan, and then later the one in Bangladesh. You might get 3 or 4 million Brits slaughtered in their beds, basically. But no more than that. At the end of that, the survivors would be fighting mad, unified, and completely cured of their liberalism. So we are not going to be exterminated in our own country. We might have a civil war in our own country, which nobody will win. And at the end of 25, 30 years of fighting a civil war, we'll end up with something like a peace deal, which will be something like, whether it's, as I was saying, the Lebanon or Syria, or going further back, what they did in Switzerland, cantonizing it and so on, and ending the civil wars there, a little bit like what we have in Northern Ireland, where the loyalists are now the minority. They're going to become a smaller minority, but there is no possibility of them losing their cultural identity. And we may end up with that. We're going to end up with that. It'd be far better if we avoid the civil war and reach the stage where you have these perhaps uneasy communities, but nevertheless they respect each other. Can I just say one more thing, Dave? Then I'll pass over to you. Just it is a flow. That the real problem here is not them. The problem is us. The problem is our people. Why should Muslims, I'm afraid, respect the trash that are now a large number of the British people, with drink and drugs and whoring and degeneracy and LGBTQ plus and aborting our own babies and all the rest of it? Why on earth should they respect us? They will respect us when our people, particularly the white working class in England, look like the white working class loyalists in Northern Ireland. I'm not talking about guns and bombs. I'm talking about unity, marching bands, all the young men involved out on the streets for their community. Everyone knows they can be called out at a moment's notice. When we once again are like that, then there'll be enough respect of our people that we can have some kind of settlement in a new multicult England, which should never have been. That's where we are now.
And coming from a west of Scotland background with strong links, over in Northern Ireland, I know exactly what you're saying, because there is still a community spirit over there. And as you say, young people, in many ways, the loyalist parts of Northern Ireland is the last true quintessentially British communities, I think, that do exist. Right. And there was, I remember hearing at the time, and I've always said this, you were the first person that I ever heard publicly speak about Pakistani, Bangladeshi rape gangs. You were, before anybody else. And I heard the story that there was attempts to try and do that over in Belfast, and some of the community leaders paid them a visit and told them what would happen to them if they tried that. And again, like with the rape gangs in the north of England, that was allowed to happen because of the breakdown of family, the breakdown of society as well, and the way these young girls were just cast out, and they weren't protected. There was our people didn't protect these girls. They were thrown to the wolves.
Absolutely. And people say, and I understand where it comes from, and I've used the argument, what's wrong with that community, that they did nothing to stop it, because they should have done. But really, why would you expect Muslims to stand up against Muslim thugs in their own communities, especially when the police, as we've seen just the last few days in Birmingham, basically let those thugs do whatever they like? So why should ordinary Muslims stand up and speak out against that, when not one British father was jailed for defending his own daughter? Not one brother, not one uncle, not one cousin, not one single one. Hence, they don't respect us. And hence, you can't expect the elite to protect us, because, as we all know, they brought them here, the elite brought them here, partly to merge us out of existence, as well as for cheap labour and all the rest of it. But you can't expect the elite to defend us. You can't expect their people to say this is wrong. It has to come from our people, and woefully it didn't. But as you say, it hasn't happened in Northern Ireland, not on either side of the community, for a very good reason.
Nick, I was down, and just while you're talking as well, and the point you're making about the sort of Balkanisation, Lebanisation, I was down speaking at the English Democrats conference, and they believe in an independent England. Do you think that would work? Do you think that could potentially be a way out of this? England would be in, but my argument against that was, how would that work with a London in it, with a Birmingham in it, with a Manchester? I mean, I don't think they would be too happy.
The overall demographics of an independent England, in terms of them and us, would actually be slightly worse, because Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales are on average not as multiculturalised as England is. Politically, it would be in a way better, because it would be slightly more conservative, because you wouldn't have the Scottish either Labour or Labour SNP alliance bloc. So it would probably shut the Labour Party out of government for some time. But what on earth is the use of that, when that means you get a Conservative government, which, as we see now, is awash with all the same liberal poison as the rest of them. So it's no better. So no, I don't think it would make any difference. Anyone who's talking about, we'll do this, we come up with this program, and then we'll put it to the ballot box, or we'll change the system so that we can win through the ballot box. It's a nonsense. It's simply too late for that. And it encourages people to think there's some people out there, the political leaders on the white horse, and they'll
trust the plan.
Yeah, no, they won't. The only people who are going to rescue you from this is you. And again, there's a problem with a lot of idealistic, especially young nationalists. I've been there myself. You sort of think, well, how are we going to save them all? How are we going to save the country? How are we going to save all our people? They don't want to be saved, most of them. They're incapable of being saved. They are the problem. The people that a youngster watching this needs to worry about is himself, his family, the girl he hasn't yet met, and the kids he hasn't yet had. Those are the people who are your responsibility. Beyond that, the people who actually share your vision, your involvement in whatever it is, a community group or a sports group or a cultural group, whatever you're involved in, your comrades in that, they are the people that you have a responsibility to. But fundamentally, your responsibility is to the past and to the future. And that means having kids and rearing them right. And none of us have any responsibility. We've all done our bit. Myself and the BNP activists collectively did our bit to give the masses their chance, and they turned it down. So don't worry about them. In the long run, they're all going to be dead anyway. Most of the Liberals don't have any kids, or at most they have one.
It's true.
The people who inherit this country, and incidentally, apart from the hardline Islamists and the hardline Orthodox Jews, the birth rates of all the ethnic groups in this country, all the non-whites, are falling exactly the same way as us. They're just a little bit behind us on the curve. The people who will decide what this country is in 100 years' time will be the people who have 5, 6, 7 kids in this generation and rear them so that at least some of those kids will go on and do the same in the next. And all the Liberals will die. And in the end, it'll be a question of who's the dominant bloc? Is it going to be the indigenous, who again will be Christian because great chaos pushes people back to faith? Will it be indigenous white Christian Brits, or will it be Orthodox Jews, or will it be Muslims? It's going to be one of those three will dominate, and the other two will be here as well, because nothing else can be done.
What about people who are just getting up and going? What about people who are leaving? They're maybe going to Hungary, they're going to Russia, they're going to Eastern Europe. What's your take on that?
Well, you can say, and it's a shame, I don't hold with the people who say, oh, you're running away, you should stand here and fight. Well, how much fighting are those people doing? If they haven't got 5, 6 kids themselves, if they're in their 30s, they're not fighting at all. It's gobshitery, basically, to say we've got to stand and fight. You stand and fight in Birmingham and London, you and your kids one day are going to be killed.
Yeah.
Simple as. So you've got to get out. So at least to somewhere more sensible and safer in the British Isles. But there's nothing wrong at all with going abroad. I would say that if a country allows you to withdraw from its if it allows you to turn off its television, if it allows you to keep your kids out of its schools, if it allows you to do your own thing, then basically you should stay here. So if you're living in the British Isles, you get somewhere as remote as possible and you do those things, particularly homeschooling and keeping your kids away from the internet. If the country allows that, you've got something of a duty to stay. The minute it doesn't allow that, your absolute duty is to the future and to ensuring that our people, our bloodline, our culture has enough youngsters in the future to be an effective force. And if the best way to do that is in fact for a significant number of Brits, I'm talking thousands, to go to places like Hungary, then if the Hungarians will allow them to keep, as well as speaking Hungarian and all the rest, to keep their British identity, their British version of Christianity, and to hark back in ways to their own country, then it's going to be a damn sight more sensible than trying to keep your kids alive in Handsworth. So if people want to do it, fair enough. But in the end, that's an individual choice. And I don't actually see, the more I've seen in Northern Ireland, in fact, the more I think that there's not a lot of points, as long as they'll allow homeschooling. And I think that the religious bloc, especially the Protestants, are so strong there, that will not be undone. But why would you take your kids and yourself to Hungary and Russia, which are very different, very, very foreign?
Yeah, they are.
When you can take them, if you have a shred of, if basically you're of British origin and identify as British, then Northern Ireland is your place. And if, as huge numbers of our British population does, you have a significant Irish ancestry, then Ireland is the place. Because although people say, and you look at the demographics now of, Dublin and Limerick and so on, and it looks terrible. I went through a large part of Ireland a couple of weeks ago, and the inner city bits, including in quite small towns, are grim. But Ireland is wall-to-wall white, wall-to-wall Irish, and the Irish fight. And I don't believe that the Irish will surrender to what's being done. The elite are in one hell of a hurry to swamp Ireland. And because the Irish do not have any white guilt complex, because they have a tradition of fighting, I think that Ireland will fight, and in this, Ireland will be right. I may be wrong, but there again, if they've got thousands of Irish stock Brits who've left London and Birmingham and all the rest of it and gone to the south and helped to warn people and helped to build up communities, it could tip the balance there as well.
Do you not think, though, Nick, there would have to be some more of a cataclysmic event? Because you had COVID, which was a real wake-up call for a lot of people as to what the government would be prepared to do to them. Basically, jab them with all sorts. I won't, because we're on YouTube. I won't go too deep there. Lock them in their homes, make them cover their faces in public. So that was a real wake up. But what I found is that most people have just kind of gone back to sleep. Do you think there's any chance of an economic meltdown? Because there is a lot of talk of hyperinflation, that the system might crash. That the US dollar might collapse.
Yep.
Because that is shown in history that when that happens, that real upheaval happens. Do you think that could be a possibility for change?
Absolutely. So I think it's not. It was always a possibility that the system, whether you want to call it capitalism or liberalism, whatever you want to call it, there was always a possibility that it would collapse under the weight of its own contradictions. It's now a certainty, because for the first time ever, you've got a corporate, global, political and economic elite who are not there to keep the thing ticking over. They're not there for growth anymore. They're playing a huge game of Jenga with our entire, it's not just the economy, but the whole of society. They are deliberately pulling bits out of it. A nuclear power station here, coal fire power here, delivery trucks that actually work, because when they say that we're going to replace diesel engines in lorries with electricity in the next 15 years, there is no technology to do that. So they're pulling out the Jenga sticks. We are facing a situation in the Soviet Union. You had enormous pain and damage and human tragedy done because you had an elite which was determined to change the ownership of the means of production. That was the core of it. They're going to change the ownership of the means of production. We've now got an elite which is committed to destroying vast swathes of the means of production, distribution and exchange. So they are destroying the very basis, the material stability of the liberal system on which they depend. And when you've got that happening, isn't will it collapse? This now is when will it collapse? And like the Jenga game, you take out the block and so on, and it wobbles a bit. Sooner or later, you take out one too many and the whole lot comes crashing down. And that's where we are. What will happen then, of course, is another matter entirely. If the British people are as gutless, disorganized, faithless as the majority are at present, then they will lose. And the ones who've had the wit, who've, as I said, thought about themselves, their families, their community, and so on, and prepared in some way or another for it, basically separating, if not completely geographically from this doomed liberal Titanic, at least separating from it psychologically, spiritually, in every way possible that they can. Every bit of separation increases their chances of survival. So plenty of our people will survive this cataclysm. You could kill half the population of Britain. It would be an appalling thing. There would still be an awful lot of Brits left.
But is it not a bit heartbreaking though, Nick, that because I remember the good times, I remember the late 80s, the early 90s, and I love, I am, and maybe not as much now, I don't like using the term, but I'm a unionist in the sense of, I love all the cities, the shared history of these islands, and it's I put up a picture the other day, it showed you Trafalgar Day in 1900, and it is heartbreaking, and I know what you're saying about. I think you're being a realist, which is probably more long in the tooth. But even to me, I still hope that there is a chance of redemption. There is a chance things can go back. But you just think it's too far gone.
It is heartbreaking. My mother died a few years ago, and one of the last things she said was that this country, when she was a little girl and brought up in London, just basically during the war, she said, and then obviously after it, she said, this was a lovely country and it was so gentle and so kind, and they've ruined it completely. And so many people, older people, have said that to me. You must have heard it yourself one way or another, and it is heartbreaking. If you think the 80s were good, I can think back to the 60s. I can remember the old money and the old measurements, and this country is now a foreign place compared to what it was. For anyone my age or older, this country is already a completely foreign place. And I'm not just talking about the faces on the street and the languages in the street, let alone the faces on television and the adverts. It's completely foreign, but that has gone. But our people will survive. The capitalist system, the liberal system, is utterly doomed. But our people will survive. Some will survive in exile. And then when the chaos has hit, How long do you think a population which insists nearly a half of all a certain ethnic group in Britain marry their first cousins?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And they also increasingly are insisting that their women are dressed from head to toe in black from the time they're about the age of 7 onwards. How long do you think that population is going to retain a competent fighting ability if it comes to it, once you no longer have a health service and free vitamins and all the rest of it? There's no doubt we're here, we're adapted to this country, we help make this country, it helped make us. And the incomers are only here because you have a liberal system of handouts, and even though some of them do work, but even those, they're only here because you have a health service that functions, and so on. And the problem will, in a very horrible way, sort itself out. And we'll be the ones who are still here and still standing. We'll take lots of casualties. And again, I'll come back and there'll be people saying, oh, this is blackpilling and so on, and we just need to fight the electoral road and so on. You can think that if you want, but I'm telling you that if you want to have a say posthumously in the running of this society of our country and what it looks like in 100 years' time, there is only one way to do it, and that is for you to have children, and lots of them, and rear them right. Or if it's too late, or if for some reason you genuinely can't, and don't tell me you can't afford it, because that's bullshit, because every single group of dirt poor migrants who come into this country, they manage to have lots of kids if they want. As a matter of fact, you can have kids and you can sponge on the state if you really want. I'm not recommending it, but you can do. When people say they can't afford kids, they say, I don't want to have kids because I'd rather have 3 foreign holidays a year. That's the truth of it. Or I don't want to have kids because I want to live and work in London because it's exciting, instead of going to some of the suburbs of the northeast of England, where you can still buy a habitable house if you do some work on it for about 40,000 quid.
The west. I talk about this a lot. The southwest of Scotland in Ayrshire, down at Stranraer, you can actually get a house there for like £10,000.
Absolutely right, David.
There are. Right. What about, Nick? Just as sort of a closing section. What about in terms of pan-European nationalism? Like, is it going to be the case that even in, say, 40, 50 years, because I think, in the latter days, Mosley was very big on that, where people will start seeing themselves as more Europeans. And I have an affinity with France. I have an affinity with Italy.
You would have, wouldn't you?
Well, that's true. With Germany. So, I know tonight we've been very focused on this as a British problem, but it's also a European problem. I mean, could you see potentially dare I say, a white European bloc emerging? Is that possible, or are there too many differences?
Not in terms of state power, for several reasons. One, the problems we've been talking about, David, it's not just ours. The demographic problem, which is, as I say, it's not just about their numbers coming in and breeding, it's about our numbers not breeding. The demographic problems of every single country in Europe are, except Ireland actually, which is a little bit better off, but all the others are as bad as ours or worse. And the only difference is, say, in a place like Hungary, an Orban has spent and put enormous amounts of effort in recent years to try to up Hungary's birth rate. So it's gone up from 1.5 to 1.7. That's as good as they can get. But a very significant number of those are gypsies. They're not even European, and they breed very, very rapidly indeed. Poland, Slovakia, these places, they're all worse. So the only good thing about their demographics is that when their old people die, it just leaves a space, a gap. When our old people die, they are being literally replaced by third worlders. So it looks worse. In many cases, it is worse. But, if you're no longer in the house, really, why would you care that someone else is in it? So the whole of Europe has got this problem. France is nearer to a catastrophic civil war with
I think so.
its community even than we are. Germany likewise.
I agree.
First and second largest Turkish cities in the world are in Germany. This isn't going to end well.
I was in Berlin over Christmas, and I just actually couldn't believe it. I was at Alexanderplatz, and it was just groups of Syrians, and the arrogance and the swagger of them. They basically were saying, well, we're in charge now, not you. And I agree, especially about France. I think that in France there is much more, because, like, in your banlieues, Saint Denis or in Marseille. I mean, these people have rocket propelled grenades. You know, they've got some serious weaponry, and I think you're right. I think France and Germany. So, well, just sort of drawing things to a close, then, Nick, and I'm hopefully we'll do this again because I found it so interesting. What do you see is happening in the next 2 to 5 years, and then slightly longer out, 20 years? What's your crystal ball? Well, and obviously it's not perfect.
I think within the next 2 or 3 years, you're going to see that the American elite gamble vis-a-vis Russia and in the Ukraine has turned into a monstrous own goal for them. And we'll see the effective end of the unipolar American inverted commas, run world, and a multipolar world in which China, India, Russia, Turkey, Iran, and so on are much more powerful. And that could well it'll take a lot of the drive out of the Kudinov-Kalergi type approach, the prestige of Hollywood and giant corporations and their advertising to breed us out of existence and so on. So that's going to be a very, very interesting thing. It also, of course, will mean a great deal of instability. And the end of the dollar as the reserve currency means the end of American military power worldwide. It also means the end, I think, of the United States as a moderately cohesive nation, as a thing. So at that point, really all bets are off. At that point, you might end up with basically a highly racist, in inverted commas, monocultural white state covering a large swathe of central North America. Mm-hmm. That'd be the place to go if that happened, without a shadow of a doubt. So it's enormous. Everything that we've taken for granted in our lifetime, in terms of the way the world looks geopolitically, is being undone before our very eyes. It's a very, very exciting time indeed. And as for what happens at home, we've talked lots of gloom and doom and blood on the carpet this evening, but I've never felt more positive about the long-term future of this country than I do now, because I have no doubt that whatever is coming, there will be people who will pull themselves up by their own bootstraps and so on out of the shambles that we are in. And because this is our country, because we're made for it, our people one day will take it back. Of that, there's no doubt at all.
On that positive note, I think you'll do the honours and end that, Nick. It was very, very informative and very interesting. So thank you very much.
I look forward to doing it again sometime fairly soon. And thanks to Chris for organising the show. Thanks to you both.
Thank you. Will you hit the button, Nick? Yep.
I have now.
Excellent. Well, let me just double check that